These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. Urartu was famous in antiquity for the quality of its smithing. Not only had the highlands long been a source of quality metals, the technological revolution of the Biaynili kingdom seems to have raised technical standards up a notch. But I don't want to tell you about it from a distance. You might remember a few years ago I did a series of basically historical fictions following the lives of a few characters from Mesopotamia as they farmed and labored. Today I want to carry that up north as we look at three men as they play their part in the magnificent smithing tradition of the Armenian highlands. But before we really get into it, I do have an announcement. Book 2 of the oldest stories is finally available for pre-order. The history and myth of Babylon and the Amorites, link down in the description, will be out May 14th, 2025. If you're listening to this after that date, you can find it on Amazon in Kindle, paperback, and hardcover. Same price as the last book, History and Myth from Sumer and Akkad. And on that, History and Myth from Sumer and Akkad will be on sale, the digital edition at least, on Amazon from the 1st of May until the 8th of May 2025. So if you're listening in that window and you've been meaning to pick the book up, it's pretty low price. It's going to be great. The new book's going to be great. Definitely check it out. Consider a pre-order or consider ordering it on the 14th. Anyway, I want to stress at the start that none of these men that I'm about to tell you about are real. This is a tale of historical fiction. I'm weaving together what we do know about the best ironworking at the dawn of the Iron Age, as well as what we know about the conditions during the founding century of Biaynili, the kingdom we now remember as Urartu. So while I intend for this to be as realistic as possible, just remember we don't have any surviving records that would allow us to reconstruct any single real person from ancient Urartu to this level of detail. And with that, our scene rises in the city in modern times known as Catapants. We don't know what it would have been called in ancient times, but we do know that Ishpuini, son of Sarduri, built a fortress there with the help of his son Menua. This town's about a day's walk from the south of the Bia capital Tushpa, which is, of course, the modern city of Van. And in this city, at the start of our story, around 800 BCE, is a man in his 20s named Dureli. Dureli doesn't talk about his past, and no one really asks him. There's no shortage of new people in the Tushpa area, all fleeing one threat or another. Dureli's home had been razed to the ground by the rising coalition of Itiuni, a alliance of warrior clans up around Lake Sevan who are trying to emulate much of the success that the Bia kingdom has been building up over the last few decades. Dureli's people are no strangers to moving from valley to valley, but in his own lifetime there seem to be fewer open spaces, fewer unclaimed valleys than his now-deceased father used to talk about. But though there's no farmland for him to claim as a settler, Tushpa is still, in its own way, a valley of opportunity for him and his fellow displaced men. Someone told him that down in Catapants he'd find a man named Ushkiuni, somewhere near the government build sites, who has no shortage of work for itinerants like himself. Dureli has walked for months through the mountains, pausing in nearly every village to labor for the food he needed to make the next leg. So just one more day, and this one along a kind of nice road that winds along the newly constructed Menua Canal, is hardly even noticed. Following the canal, he knows he's arrived when he sees a half-finished temple just off the road. He doesn't even need to ask around. There's just a milling crowd of similarly shabby but sturdy men waiting near a set of donkey carts. He inserts himself into the mob, eventually reaching the front of what could only very generously be called a line. And the scribe near the carts, writing on with a paintbrush on treated bark, asks for his name, then asks if he wants to work in the city or in the mountains. Durelli asks which pays more, and the scribe laconically replies, "The mountains." Durelli nods, and the scribe jabs his brush over towards the carts on the left. After a few hours waiting and the meal of roasted grain, the carts departed, Durelli and the other men walking behind them. They walked for 4 days. As the second day closed, they began to see mines, iron and copper, worked by men much like themselves. Durelli had not seen mining at this scale before. In his home region, the tradition had been for multiple clans to come together for a few weeks at a long-known mining site, and the men would together fashion stone tools and fires to pull metal just from the surface. And those among the clans with the inherited knowledge would fashion a few items for general use and a few items for trade. These camps, though, weren't temporary gathering sites, and they didn't merely scrape along the surface. Arriving on the 4th day, Durelli was put to work without any chance to rest from his travels. He didn't understand the dialect down here, but there wasn't really that much to understand. He was handed a pick with a recently resharpened iron tip and a wooden handle worn smooth by other men's hands, and sent into a pit deeper than the height of 2 men. Overseers waved him to a particular spot on the wall. Durelli knew men like these had the secrets of reading the rocks, of knowing how to follow the colors and the contours to reach the valuable ores. Durelli himself could tell ore from stone, but the deeper secrets were kept among the higher status men in his own tribes. He chipped away at the unneeded stone. His form, endurance, and disinterested obedience satisfied the overseer in short order, and he was left to pick at his own slightly slower pace to save his energy. When the sun went down, an overseer whistled, and the men, as one, dropped their equipment where they stood and queued up to take the ladder out of the pit. Durelli went with the free men over to a camp not that different from the slaves' camp. There was a bowl of mutton and vegetable soup, light on the mutton, and a piece of flatbread. The other workers told him that he was lucky to have a soup on his first day. It was grain porridge 3 days out of 4, but at least the free men's camp was fed a large enough portion that they weren't left wanting. But there was no grumbling at this. To not have to worry about where the next meal was coming from was a sign of the remarkable prosperity of this new Bia kingdom. All the men here had known lives far harder in the highlands. The next morning Durelli returned to his spot, and the overseer moved him a bit to a section where the rock was a different color. After seeing that his pick didn't have the same purchase in the stone as yesterday, the overseer went and pulled in a group of slaves. These men were little different from the free men, except that rather than having entered into Biainilia's transience, they had been members of clans that had opposed the Bia military's steady expansion. With a whip on the leg to motivate them, they brought a fire down the ladder, piling wood right against the stone where Durelli had been digging. Another man fanned the flames towards the wall as they began to heat the stone face. With the stone heating, they all, Durelli included, crowded in, positioned uncomfortably with sandaled feet just outside the fire to swing picks against the heated wall. After hot minutes that seemed like hot hours, a voice called and the men pulled back. As soon as everyone pulled back, 3 slaves with water buckets threw them against the stone, aiming the water so that it would slide down the side rather than splash into the fire. In Durelli's understanding, the elements of fire and water did battle along that stone, creating surface fissures. The diggers jumped right back in right away as the slaves rebuilt the fire beneath them, picks targeting those cracks in the stone. Durelli's pick quickly struck home, shattering a fissure into a larger void, and a larger chunk broke away. Through the smoke he was able to see the distinctive reddish shine of ore, and he called out to the overseer. His reward was a nod, and the fires were recentered around Dorelli's breakthrough. The slaves were whipped again, lightly this time as a friendly reminder, and the cycle of fire, pick, water, pick broke through the solid stone face. As the midday heat picked up, Dorelli nearly fell out, but finally the first chunks of ore were extracted, and perhaps as a kindness, an overseer assigned Dorelli to take the buckets to the lift station, where he would be able to take some water and rest. The bucket of ore was not light, not after the efforts he'd put in, but Dorelli had lived a hard life, and he just moved it anyway. The lift station was a wooden crane positioned near the ladder at the top of the pit, where 2 men used a pulley to lift more weight than 6 men could normally. As the bucket went up, Dorelli took the ladder and sat for a break. He watched the lifter men carry the bucket over to the smelting ovens. These weren't like bread ovens. These smelting ovens are more like cylinders, and made more crudely than a mud brick or stone oven that might be built for a community. In Dorelli's own experience, each of these cylinders was one use, but his break soon ended and he was returned down to the pit to resume earning his very modest keep. The man who took the bucket of ore from Dorelli was Urartu, the smelter's assistant, and he handed it to his uncle Kurbani. The 2 of them had been part of a clan that had joined the Bia coalition soon after Tushpa had been founded, seeing the value of the new centralized market King Sarduri was creating. Kurbani would often shake his head at the growth of the mining operation within his lifetime, and he'd talk about the days when he'd been miner and smelter and forger because there'd been so few people to work the traditional claim in their settled village. Nowadays, almost none of the people in their village still worked the mine, instead growing food a few hours' walk away with the new techniques of the Biainili that increased the harvest enough so that just one village, plus some imports, could support such a large mine. It helped that the village had grown, swallowing 2 of the fields of the neighbors that had resisted King Ishpuini's campaigns in the region, but overall it was still the same village. But for all their newfound prosperity, Kurbani was still happiest practicing the traditional Hurrian smelting techniques. They'd been given by Hurrian gods whose names were unknown to outsiders, when the rest of the world still knew nothing of iron. Or at least that's the local tradition. He lights a fire at the bottom of the bloomery, the chest-high clay cylinder which is reinforced with reeds and carefully smoothed on the inside for an even cavity of exact size. And then he placed the first batch of charcoal in the layer right above the kindling. Waving to his nephew Urartu, the younger man slowly, carefully pumped the bellow. Bellows shaped varied from place to place, but here they used a large clay bowl the size of a man's belly, and attached cloth to the rim, then attached a flat wooden paddle to the top to make that thick cloth rise and fall, pressing air into the base of the flame. A single slow stroke was all that it needed to take the spark into full flame, and the charcoal began to glow on the edges. Confident that it had caught, Kurbani lowered the first layer of crushed ore down the chimney. Sometimes the ore came out as big rocks and needed to be smashed up a bit, but this batch had been picked out bit by bit, and all Kurbani had needed to do was pick the obvious chaff out. Atop this layer went another layer of charcoal, then another layer of crushed ore, and then another layer of charcoal, then another layer of ore, and so on, all the way to the top of the column. Kurbani then sat as his nephew began to pump the bellows, both men watching the small hole at the bottom where the flame inside was visible. The flame needed to be kept hot, bright, and lightly colored, but also the smoke coming out the top of the chimney needed to be monitored so that it wasn't too thick. A constant flow and high heat were critical here, and the bellow would need to run continually. Kurubani noted the position of the sun and knew that it would need to cross half the sky before the work was done. And so he sat for a bit and fixed the sky position of the completed sun while keeping the smoke and flame in his field of view. Urartu pumped with endurance. He'd done this for a long time, and he'd built up the muscles required, but no man could run the bellow for an entire run. His uncle came to relieve him after a while Urartu got a meal for both of them. Hours later, both men worn from the work and alertness, Kurubani made a signal to Urartu, and the younger man set aside the bellows with relief. Kurubani grabbed his scooping tool and steeled himself. This next step was why he could be instantly recognized as a smith. Among a race of men with naturally hairy arms, Kurubani would routinely burn away all the hair as he reached into the still-hot bloomery tubes with his scooping tool to extract the material inside while it was still hot. The first scoop went into the slag pit, which is just a hole in the ground where he tossed the still-hot waste products, while the valuable bloom was placed more gently into a scorched and well-worn open clay bowl. Moving quickly, Kurubani cleared the chimney while Urartu cleaned up around them. Once his uncle was done, Urartu lifted the thick clay bowl, barely wrapping his arms around its circumference. It was heavy when empty, and it was a particular lift when full, but Urartu had the vigor of youth and the endurance of a hard highland life, and he brought it to the workbench without a complaint. Kurubani looked down the empty chimney. His nephew would need to clean it once it cooled down, but there were still very few cracks and burn marks. Because they made their chimneys smooth and well-sized, packing the clay and reinforcing it with straw, these bloomeries would last many firings, unlike the temporary single-use bloomeries more common among the nomadic highland miners. Still, no bloomery was permanent, and after 10 or 20 firings it'd need to be torn down and rebuilt. Thankfully, that wouldn't be today. After inspecting the chimney, Kurubani followed his nephew to his workbench. Using iron tongs to pull out the bloom, he placed it on a stone slab of unusual hardness and began to hammer out the slag and air pockets. He'd awoken with the sun that morning, but the hammering process needed to happen while the bloom was still hot, and so he'd be hammering late into the night, each bloomstone losing over half its size as he expelled air and the non-iron material still trapped inside, leaving small, dense blocks of good, workable iron. Kurubani would never have this thought, since this is just the way things had always been for him, but a modern looking at him might think that in the ancient world, there's nothing worth doing that doesn't involve multiple, complex, and labor-intensive steps. At least Kurubani, as an important member of the clan operating the mine, is compensated well enough that his wife can afford land and some indentures to work on it. With a few generations of this operation, if no one grows indolent, or no war or famine or plague sweeps through, the clan is well on its way to ascend to being properly upper class. The chances of that being allowed to happen are pretty slim, but not impossible. Already within his wider kinship network, he has close ties with a cousin who's leveraged his skills for his family's wealth. Kurubani packs his worked iron blooms into the basket for pickup. Some folks from the village come by a few times a year with a trade cart. Iron's heavy, but not very bulky, and so it seems like a waste to transport just that. They're going to fit the iron blooms into a corner of the cart, already full with grain, wool, cheese, beer, fabric, and other village products for sale at the Tushpa markets. And this time, Kurubani's nephew, Urartu, will be traveling with it. Urartu's not going to be heading to the market, at least not to sell the raw iron. While it could be sold on the market if they wanted, it's often far more valuable when sold within existing kinship or relational networks. As he approaches the home of his uncle's cousin, a smith named Arsheba, he sees all the signs of the prosperity that his uncle dreams of. Like most houses in the region, it's a rectangle of rooms built adjacent to a courtyard, but instead of mud brick atop a stone foundation like so many of his neighbors, Arsheba's house is stone up to almost waist high, and then mud brick worked among wooden supports, rather like the fortresses that Urartu had seen dominating the city skyline as he entered. The courtyard is covered by a thick woven fabric awning, this one large enough to cover nearly the whole courtyard and clearly fresh, the blue dye still vivid and unweathered. Peering through the gate, they appear to have 5 separate rooms in their house, reflecting the significant wealth that Arsheba has accumulated in his craft. And out the back, Urartu knows there's a second courtyard that holds the forge. The courtyard holds 6 women and children, all active with the work of the day. A matron sits by the cook fire, tending a soup in a pot while laying out flat dough discs on the flat rocks next to the fire to bake into flatbreads. The smell wafts even outside the courtyard, and Urartu can tell that not only is it a rich mix of vegetables and herbs thickened by grain, but there's also definitely meat in that soup. 2 toddlers chase each other around the fire energetically, occasionally being swatted away by the matron when they get too close to her various cooking supplies. Sitting at the courtyard wall, her head just over the mud brick fence, sits a woman some years older than Urartu, of an age to be the mother of those 2 toddlers, patiently spinning thread for most of the day. She's positioned where she can get a chance to gossip with other passing ladies, but it isn't the time of the day when many are out, so she sits quietly with her thoughts for now. 2 women, each a bit younger than Urartu, clean the courtyard and rooms of the house, one with broom and one with cloth and water. It's the older of these, the broom girl, that Urartu has his eyes on as he stands awkwardly at the courtyard gate. Urartu is ushered in by the older women. They know why he's there, and they also know why he's actually there. Business first, though, as he hefts his basket of iron through to the back courtyard. Urartu exchanges warm greetings with his relative, the smith Arsheba, and the smith's son Shulini. The whole family is a branch of Urartu's Hurrian clan, having moved to Tushpa around the time Urartu was born 15 years ago to take advantage of the rapidly growing demand in the new capital. Such a rapidly growing kingdom has an almost insatiable demand for the output of traditionally skilled smiths of the highlands. Urartu knows the value of what he's carrying, and the price he asks is rather less than he could possibly get on the open market. But it maintains a solid relationship with the smith, and more importantly, Urartu makes his asks for the real goal in this exchange. Talmia, the smith's middle daughter and Urartu's second cousin once removed, is still uncourted, and yes, the tie between Urartu's family at the mining camp and Arsheba's smithing family would be good to re-solidify with another in-marriage. Arsheba pretends to drive a hard bargain to make sure that Urartu is man enough to really stand his ground, but the 2 negotiate a deal whereby Arsheba will get a fraction of the iron delivered with each shipment over the next 18 months just as a gift to him, and at the end of it, he will allow Urartu to marry his younger daughter and take her to live at the mining village. Talmia is not asked directly about this. The exchange only needs to happen between the father and the prospective husband. But it's no secret that Urartu is a healthy, strong, lusty young man who comes around often, and that the ties between the 2 families would naturally want to be strengthened over time. If she had found him terribly objectionable, she's had informal chances to object. Of course, that doesn't mean that the engagement would be called off even if she did object, but honestly, it usually would. Urartu leaves after a pleasant talk with his future father-in-law. The arrangement of supplying iron will bind their families together as well in a web of both mercantile and familial relations, and Urartu was sent as an envoy specifically to ensure that these ties would persist in the next generation. The smith's son and apprentice, Shalini, would like to go to the market to gossip with his friend and relative Urartu, but the iron has just arrived, and there's work to be done now. Urartu will be leaving empty-handed for now, but before he returns to the mining camp, the smiths will need to be turning out some of that iron that's just been delivered into pickheads for the mines. The other part of the negotiated payment will be the delivery of some livestock purchased from the city markets over to the mining camp, but Arshiba will take care of that later, bartering the livestock from the finished good that he creates with the iron that was just delivered. Fortunately, the furnace was still hot from the work that he'd just finished. He'd just made an iron pin, just a small thing the length of his finger for holding up the hair of some wealthy lady. At the end of the pin, he'd put a small iron ball, the kind of work that required delicate hammers and a good bit of patience. Later, as part of his apprenticeship, Arshiba would have Shalini form a bit of bitumen tar around the iron ball into some kind of rough shape, probably an eagle or a lion as those were popular now, and then once the tar had dried, they would get a bit of silver from the temple's market and hammer a very small piece out into a foil. Then they'd wrap it around the rough shape of the bitumen eagle, and then carefully, with a stylus and light chisel, Shalini would work in the details of the lion or the eagle or the plant motifs in order to make an exquisite decorative end piece for the pin. This was the sort of thing that, despite taking less man-hours and less materials than a hand tool, could pay significantly higher. The demand was lower, though, and it would probably take a while to sell it, so Arshiba's house still did most of its work in tools and weapons, the staples of the ancient iron industry. Arshiba goes to the basket of iron that just arrived, and he hefts a lump appreciatively. Unlike the stuff he gets from other suppliers, his cousin's bloomery was always quite thorough, ejecting a good deal of the slag and leaving much purer iron, making Arshiba's job that much easier. Still, even the best bloomery of this era is imperfect, and so before he can start anything, he takes 3 smallish lumps and puts them on the coals. Alternating between the 3 of them, he uses his iron tongs to pull out one at a time, put it on a flat anvil, and hammer out the remaining imperfections, and then put it back on the heat and start hammering another one. Once the 3 are visibly purer and smoother, he puts them deeper into the forge oven and has Shalini start to pump the bellows. Arshiba watches the color of the coals, the thickness of the smoke, and the color of the metal. There's no chemical or metallurgical theory here, just long experience gained over generations. And when the colors have been right for the right amount of time, he pulls all 3 pieces out onto the anvil. Shalini comes with his own tongs to hold the pieces down and to hold them together, as Arshiba hammer welds the hot fragments into a single whole piece, already about the size of a pickhead. He flash cools it into a bucket of water from Lake Van. Its undrinkable minerals absorb into the material, reducing the iron's purity as it cools, which seems to strengthen the welds. And then immediately it goes back on the fire. A few more rounds of firing, hammering, and quenching, and he has a bucket of drinking water, Lake Van water, and rancid oil that each quench the heat in different ways. And soon enough he's got the general shape of a pickhead, with a hole in the middle where the miners can attach a wooden handle. Just the general shape is far from enough, though, but his son Shalini is now at the point in his apprenticeship where he's learning the finishing of goods, and so Arshiba goes to the bellows to watch his son learn his craft. Shalini throws the piece onto the fire, and his father corrects the positioning, not realizing that an unbalanced location in the forge might cause the wrong level of carburization. He just knows that if he puts it in the right spot in the forge, it's going to hold its edge better and take on what he thinks of as a harder color. But Shalini is experienced enough that he does pull it out at the right time, and then he hammers the sides into a more finished orientation, putting the main point on the one end. A few more rounds and there's a point on both ends of the pick, and the handle attachment hole has been given a chiseled slot for a future handle to have a better grip on the piece. One final quench, and they set it aside. Later, Shalini will take all the finished picks, they are going to be making a few of them, and he's going to painstakingly rub them against sharpening stones to smooth out the flats and to sand the edges into nice points. Arshiba has taught Shalini to fill his mind with prayer hymns to Haldi as he worked the sharpening stones. He would bless the final product, and it helps keep the mind busy so that you don't stop earlier than you should. As Arshiba pulled out the next lump of iron and pumped his own bellows, he watched his son work with a precision that reminded him of his own training under his uncle. They'd been out in the mountains still in those days. Biainili hadn't arrived yet, but Arshiba had intentionally arranged his workshop here in town just the same way it had been laid out in those distant mountains long ago. He hadn't seen his cousin Kurubani in a long time, and there was a good chance that this upcoming wedding between Kurubani's apprentice and Arshiba's own daughter might be the last time they see each other for quite a long time. The thought softened his heart, and he pulled out the lump and began to hammer. Perhaps there was a memento he could put together for his distant cousin. They'd once been so close, apprentices together in their youth, all of the young men of the clan learning right at the mouth of the mine how to work the iron. In those days, the mine was operated by only a handful of ragged slaves that they'd captured by hand from the villages a few valleys over. Wretched men, beaten and starved into submission because the youths above lacked the discipline and organization to keep them in line any other way. Arshiba shakes his head ruefully to clear the nostalgia. Those slaves had died so fast. He and his buddies had been so irresponsible and wasteful, but it had been good days in his memory. Things were more organized now, more disciplined, and more prosperous as a result. Arshiba appreciated the good, but he couldn't help but long wistfully for what had been. Thinking on it further, his mind returned to an inventory of who had placed orders with him and what iron supplies he expected to come in soon. Being illiterate, he'd always practiced his memory, and knew that he could rely on it far more than the magics of the scribes that stole their memories away. He wasn't affiliated with a temple or the government directly, and so his buyers were always a hodgepodge of demands and special orders and peculiar needs. There was a trader that he would sell weapons to that would take caravans off to the distant eastern mountains where lapis lazuli, tin, and other exotic stones came from. There was an Assyrian with a warehouse near the fortress who was always interested in custom pieces that Arshiba assumed got carried down to the soft lowlanders of the south. Then there were many who had moved to the Tushpa region from the mountains who needed tools and trusted a fellow Hurrian from the rural areas, one with old and distant clan connections to their own clan, more than any other tribal ethnicities in the fast-growing city. And his suppliers were just as diverse, rare metals coming from the same long-distance trader who went east, and iron from a number of communities just like his cousin Kurubani's. Thinking about his stock and orders, he did have a bit he could spare for the wedding. An engraved axe head would be appreciated, something which would be imposing whether defending or raiding neighborhood valleys. There was less of that than there had been when the two of them had been growing up, but there would surely be no end to the conflicts of the highlands, no matter how much Biainili came to dominate the region. And he would need wedding gifts for bride and groom, though those he would buy, possibly from the proceeds of the pin when he found a noblewoman to buy it. Economics was never far from his mind, but he's far enough from the threat of starvation that the value of his work in advancing his status and supporting his wider clan often takes precedence. Dureli, Kurubani, and Arshiba are not real people, and these are not real lives I've been describing. It is at best an estimate, drawn from the collective evidence available to us about daily life and the iron industry of the Iron Age Armenian highlands. But even if more evidence was still available, there is a distinct sense in which we could perhaps tell the story better, but still never really know what it was like to be a man in these times. The past is a foreign country, and much about the Armenian highlands renders it even more alien than their Mesopotamian contemporaries. And yet, they were still men, sharing a common humanity. Whether they were raising their families, or struggling on their farms, or committing war crimes on quite flimsy pretexts, they were fundamentally just like us. And it would be us had we been born in their time and place, and we would look at those modern men with their podcasts and their internets and their democracies as something strange and probably inferior. It is just the way of things. Next week we return to the grand narratives of kings and wars as we finish out the impressive reign of King Menua and follow it up with his warrior son Argishti. So join us next time for a long-forgotten war, a good bit of palace drama, and possibly the origins of some new and more interesting engineering feats. Thank you for listening.